Hello. So I'm Michael, not Steve, from IBM. So I'm a consultant in IBM's, we can call it Advanced Analytics and Optimization practice. We're essentially OR practitioners, although I too do not have a OR qualification. I'm a physicist. So I've been at IBM for about 6 years now, working with doing various types of analytics projects. The project I'm going to talk to you about today is called the RFU Tri-Tracker, using analytics to drive fan engagement. I'll talk to you, I'll tell it, so hopefully the story will be quite interesting. If you're interested in following me and my ramblings on Twitter, my handle's up there. That's a relic from a university nickname. You might just be able to pick up a hint of an accent, although I've been in London 12 years now, so it's kind of disappearing. So this was a project with the RFU, and I don't know if you can, if any of you are big rugby fans or can cast your minds back to the Rugby World Cup in 2011, which was a real kind of nadir for English rugby, which was great for me as a Scot. There was, allegations of dwarf throwing in New Zealand bars, people jumping off boats into the harbour, and just generally the organisation lost a lot of respect. So at that point they changed CEO. A chap called Ian Ritchie came in, who previously was the CEO at Wimbledon. And he wanted to help the RFU turn over a new leaf. And one of the key things around turning over a new leaf was to try and grow the game of rugby union at all levels, and that means get new people into the game, and get just generally drive engagement, make people interested, talk about rugby a bit more. But that has a number of challenges, three of which are up there. So there's public perceptions of rugby. I'm not sure if any of the Bullington Club actually played rugby, but it's a nice public perception in that it's seen as a game for public schoolboys, the social elite, and the common man plays football rather than rugby. So they needed to challenge that perception. And if you're a newcomer to the game and you don't have a clue about it, it's a non-trivial scoring, and if you just turn on the TV and there's a game of rugby union going on and you don't really understand the game, it just sometimes looks like a pile of bodies on the floor, or just a rammy, and you're like, well, I don't have a clue what that is, I'm going to turn the telly on. So, if you think about the types of people who the RFU would target with this type of thing, there's kind of Pete the novice over there, he turns it on and sees Rammy, he's what's going on. There's perhaps Lats fans who used to know what was going on, but kind of forgotten, and then you've got expert fans who know everything. And growing the game was really about capturing the people on the left who didn't know anything about rugby, and retaining people on the right. You don't want to alienate your core audience. You don't want to dumb the game down and make it sound trivial. So they brought us in to see how could we use analytics to drive this type of engagement. But if we think about how people engage with sports events now, right now we're in this connected customer era. I just need to go back a couple of times. So we're in the connected era, which is where people are engaging with the sports event as it happens. So, and the best way I can use to describe it is to describe my own experiences as a boy when I was watching Dunfermline Athletic growing up. So that was in the physical era, and my whole weekend kind of revolved around the Dunfermline game. So on the Saturday morning, I would be all excited about going to the match. Then I would go to the match and we'd lose, and I'd be very depressed on Saturday evening. And then that depression would last through till Sunday morning, when I would get all the Sunday papers, read about the game, analyse it, prepare my excuses for school the next morning as to why we lost. Then I would go to school the next morning, argue with my friends that it was a completely unjustified defeat, the referee was against us, various things. And then the game kind of left my system. It left my system at around about sort of Tuesday morning. That's when I forgot about it and started thinking towards next week. But now we're in a completely different era when, as the game's going on, people are on forums, they're online, they're tweeting about it, they're on Facebook about it. I don't know if anybody's tried to not know the scores before match of the day, which they still tell you to do on the news beforehand, but it's pretty much impossible because it's just everywhere. So that time span where people interact with the game is much, much more compressed. So if you're wanting to drive engagement and get people involved in the game, then you need to be doing it pretty much as the game's going on. There's no point producing a wonderful piece of analysis, 3 days later that's really engaging and interesting, because the game's left everybody's system by then. So we thought, we are IBM, so we do technology and analytics. So we thought, what kind of interesting real-time analytics could we do that would add to the experience of the game? And we came up with, if we remember that our target audience are really people who don't understand rugby that well, they used to understand it or don't have a clue. We felt that that really came down to three things. The first thing is, which team is winning? And by winning, I mean which team's on top right now. And I have a real problem with current sports broadcasting whenever a broadcaster is trying to say who's on top in a game, they'll always fling up a possession statistic or a territory statistic, and that's completely meaningless without any context. So I went away and thought, well, I must be able to do better than that. I must be able to give a real-time indication of which team is actually playing better. So this, I don't know how many of you watched England against New Zealand at the weekend, but this is a momentum graph that I've derived from all of the events that are happening in the game. So we've partnered with a company called Opta, who are a sports data company. And they send us through about sort of between 1,500 and 2,000 events on the rugby pitch as they happen. So that's things like tackles, rucks, knock-ons, passes, kicks, all of that type of thing. And we pick them up, who's done it, where it happened, and we convert that into momentum by assigning each event a score based on who did it, where it was on the pitch, and what type of event it was. And then you can just use some analytics and come and see me at the IBM stand if you want to go into the detail, because I can go into a lot of detail about this. And you can weight which team has actually has created the most momentum points over periods of time, and then you get a nice graph that shows the ebb and flow of the match. So the point I like to point out is that trough around about the kind of 20th minute there. So that's where the momentum is all with the All Blacks. At that point, if you watch the game, England won a penalty in the New Zealand 22. And it was an easy 3 points to goal, but Chris Robshaw elected to kick it to touch. England built up a huge amount of pressure and eventually scored a try. You can see the line going right up to momentums with England now, and that becomes a great talking point about the game. So if you're new to the game, you can say, well, that's a turning point, here's why it was a turning point, and begin to give that editorial insight into what the important things in a rugby match are. So that's the first thing. Which team is winning, which team is playing well. The second thing is why are they winning? And so we came up with this concept called keys to the game. So what this is for each matchup, so in this case England against New Zealand, we ran a number of essentially decision trees against what happens when England play against New Zealand and teams like New Zealand. So we use clustering techniques to kind of pick out teams like New Zealand, which there kind of aren't many, but there are lots of teams like England. And so we worked out what the most important factors are for England when they come up against teams like New Zealand. So, and that breaks down to stats. So we've got tackles, so they had to make a certain percentage of their tackles, they had to average a certain number of metres per carry, and they had to break the line as much as they could. Well, 5 times would be the benchmark. And then these things are actually quite trivial pieces of arithmetic that as the events come in, you can just track them and visualise them quite nicely to say, well, are England doing the things that they need to do to win the game? Well, in this case, no, they weren't. They were close on the tackles, sort of halfway there on the metres per carry, but they were horrible at breaking the line because the New Zealand defence is so good. On the flip side, New Zealand has slightly different metrics because you flip the algorithm around to say, well, for New Zealand to win against England and teams like England, then this is what they need to do. So that turns into they need to make a certain number of kicks from hand, achieve a certain number of turnovers, and have a certain scrum win percentage. And these are all things that, again, add a bit of colour for somebody who's new to the game. What's a scrum? Why do we need to win it? Why is it important? It's just a way into the conversation if you don't know about rugby. And we track them in real time, so New Zealand got 2 keys compared to England 0, which begins to start explaining why perhaps the New Zealand team are better and won that game. And then the last thing is kind of a natural extension of the momentum concept, which is if we're scoring each event on the pitch and we're assigning a weighting to it as to how important that is to the overall context of the match, we can see which players are actually contributing most to the overall result. And so we pick out the top 3 for each team. So England's best player, according to me, was Vinny Vunipola. Then it was Chris Ashton, which would cause some debate, and blank type his face. And then Billy Twelvetrees. And then for New Zealand, Kieran Reid, Savea and Manonu. I don't know if you watched the match, and I'd love to hear your opinions on whether we got that right or not. But these are again things that we've got analytics driving all of this, and we're putting it out to the consumer. We're about 10 to 15 seconds behind the broadcast, and if you're watching on Sky Go, we're usually actually ahead of it, which was annoying my friends because they were watching it on Sky Go and I was running this and was telling them 15 seconds in advance of a try, which they didn't do. So, because we're IBM, we have to have some kind of architecture-y type slide, so this is it. So what we've got for a live event, so Opta are there at the game, they're keying in the data, they're giving us the events. We then took all of the international rugby games over the last 5 years, which is somewhere between 250 and 300 games, and we used that to build some analytical models which drive each of the analytical components, so the momentum, the keys to the match, and the player influence. Then, as the data comes in during the game, we score those data points against those models and pass them to Aqueduct, who the digital agency that built the front end of the application, and then that gets sent out to the viewer, so to the consumer. So it's quite a complex little scenario. Those of you familiar with data mining products will recognise that that's the Twillington icon, good IBM data mining product there. So that's how it worked. How did we do? So we covered about 8 games so far. So this is how we do on keys to the match. So the first game we ever covered was England against Scotland, which was a really depressing game for me because we got smashed. But the keys balanced out for England winning. They did what they needed to do to win. There's one anomaly down there. So England against Argentina. I don't know if any of you saw that game, but Argentina actually achieved all 3 of the keys. England only achieved 1. And what that's saying is that Argentina did as well as they could, but it wasn't quite enough. And that's because the keys algorithm doesn't include a inherent ability of the team. So it's saying the team, Argentina, did everything that they could do within their power to win the game, but because England have fundamentally better players, and even though England didn't do everything that they needed to do, they still managed to win. Most influential players. So what we did. So this is for the 3 TD internationals that we got. So we reckon the top 5 English players were Vunipola, Brown, Ashton, Roger, and Farrell. Generally speaking, what I read in the media is that Vunipola and Brown were judged to have done pretty well. Chris Ashton, perhaps not so much. But I have a number of arguments as to why he's been perhaps unfairly criticised. We then pulled out a kind of team of the tournament for the opposition for England, which was quite interesting. Again, it backs up that perhaps Argentina were slightly hard done by. They played really well, and Australia were breathless. They only get 1 goal, which was kind of eye-opening. And that's pretty much everything I want to say, to be honest. So I'd love to take any questions. I don't know if I've got time for questions.
Have any questions? I thought there would be. I'm just curious, how much does your analysis of why certain teams are winning match what kind of pundits and commentators are saying? Are you kind of perhaps debunking the claims they're making about why certain teams are winning, or does it match what they're saying?
At this stage, not really, because I don't know how well you know rugby. But the things that we're picking out in keys to the match, you need to make your tackles. Well, anybody who knows the game knows that. So it's more about bringing people who don't necessarily know much about rugby into the game and giving them a way into the conversation. Experts, we've turned up a couple of interesting things. So I think we ran a little piece of analysis that showed, I think something like 80% of the time, the team that has more line breaks actually goes on to win. People didn't realise that it was that important. But again, they know that breaking the line is key to the game of rugby. So I wouldn't say that we've been debunking any myths, because we're not really targeting this type of thing at people who really know the game.